Now let's go through some examples for when you should consider leading on the turn. So let's say under the gun +1 against the big blind, under the gun +1 raises, big blind calls, flop comes jack 6-2, big blind checks, under the gun +1 bets small, as they're going to do with much of their range in this scenario, and then the big blind calls. Now, you want to look at the cards that are good for the big blind in this scenario and consider leading them. And you can tell pretty clearly a 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2 are all actually pretty great for the player in the big blind. Remember I said whenever the middle or bottom card pairs, that's usually good for the big blind, assuming they have a decent amount of 6s and 2s in their range. And also whenever there are 3 cards to a straight on the turn, especially if the other card on the board is not particularly high, then those low cards, as you can see here, 5, 4, 3, are also going to be pretty good. You may notice in this exact scenario, the 2 is not particularly amazing, whereas the 6 is substantially better. And that's because you actually don't have a whole lot of 2s in your big blind defending range against under the gun +1. If this board was perhaps jack 6, 5 instead, then the 5 would be very good for you. But it is interesting to see here that the 4 is actually the best card. The 4, 3, and 2, I'm sorry, the 4, 3, and 5 are all like really, really solid cards to at least consider leading on. Now, however, notice here that just because your equity increases, that's not actually going to mean you should be leading on these cards. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because it's not just that your equity increases that when you need to be leading. You also want to be leading when you have a big nut advantage. And you're going to find that you really only have the nut advantage when the turn is the 6 and, perhaps a little bit when it's the 2. All these big cards, of course, are terrible for you because whenever under the gun +1 bets, they're going to have a lot of random high cards, and, clearly, like the ace is terrible, right? So let's take a look at how often you should be leading on various turns. And you see here that even though the 4, 3, and 5 all increased your equity more than the 6 actually gives you a substantial nut advantage, to the point that the GTO strategy on a 6 is to actually bet, 75% of the time, which is a lot. Notice the 2 is just like okay, right? And that's because, like I said, you don't actually have a ton of 2s in your range. So it's kind of neat to see that even though your equity is lower on a 6 than it is on a 4, you're leading substantially more on the 6. And this is where the idea of nut advantage is vitally important. Okay, so let's take a look at that one spot where you are leading a decent chunk. By the way, these scenarios where you're leading almost never, I would just lead never, because, notice you're still checking like 87% of the time, right? So you might as well check 100% on these cards because they're not quite as good for you. Like I said, it would be a little bit different if the board was like jack 6, 5, 4, or jack 6, 5, 7, or jack 6, 5, 5. Then you would have potentially additional cards you can consider leading on. Let's take a look at the one spot you are leading on frequently, though. Jack 6, 2, 6. Notice now you have all of these 6s in your range, right? And whenever this is the case, you're typically going to want to be betting with your decent top pairs and better. I understand that your jacks could be behind, but also notice your jacks don't really care if they get protection, right? Like if your opponent does have king, queen, and they fold it out. It's fine when you have jack 8, right? So this is a scenario where you can pretty much bet all the 6s for just like extreme value. The jacks for like slightly lesser value. And then as many bluffs as you can possibly find. And in this scenario, the obvious bluffs are just the various 1 overcard cards. Also gut shots if you have them. Notice we don't actually have them here. Flush draws, clearly. And then I also have the 2s betting. And that's just because I really do want to find a bunch of draws in this scenario. And the 2s I recognize don't exactly count as draws. The problem is if you check a 2 and your opponent bets, you probably just need to fold. Well, it's pretty dicey. And if you if it goes check on the turn, if your opponent bets the river, you probably should also fold. So you end up essentially not realizing your equity well with the 2s, but they do have some equity, and they are the best hand a decent chunk of the time. So you're going to find usually the worst bottom pairs opt to lead as draws in this scenario. And that's just because we have so many premium made hands, right? So recognize that in this scenario, we have a lot of nuts. Notice if the turn was, let's say, a 3 instead. Sure, we have some like 6 3s and jack 3s and, well, we'd have 5-4 suited some portion of the time. I know we don't this time, but we'd have 5-4 sometimes. I probably check raise these on the flop immediately, but you would probably not end up check raising all of them. So anyway, you'll see that in this scenario, those cards are fine for your range, but they actually are not all that great in terms of giving you the super nut advantage, whereas when the 6 comes, you really do have a super nut advantage. Okay? Solver recommends checking 26% of the time here. Using this strategy of checking some jacks, some bottom pairs, and some ace highs, you see we're still checking 35%. So perhaps I should just be betting even more. Like maybe I'm supposed to bet all my twos. Maybe I'm supposed to bet more of this like random ace high junk. Let's see what the solver does. Solver does actually bet a lot of their twos. Not all of their twos, but a lot of their twos. Solver does bet some ace high junk, like ace 7, you see, ace 7 and ace 8 betting. I think I actually did have those betting because I have an overcard to the 6. Not that it really matters all that much. Mainly I have an overcard to the 2, but I guess these do as well too, right? So maybe I should be betting those. But you see a whole lot of betting. And also notice a whole lot of small betting. Whenever you have the nut advantage, you don't really mind giving your opponent very good odds to call because they're going to be in such terrible, terrible shape against your range. Trying to connect. Perfect timing, everybody. Perfect timing. All right, we're back. Okay, good. So that's the scenario where solver is leading very frequently using a small size. Okay, now let's take a look at King 7-5. Don't cheat, don't look down here. Ask yourself which cards are good for you and which cards are good for your opponents. Well, in this scenario, pretty clearly a 7 is going to be great, a 5 is going to be great, and I think these middle cards are going to be pretty decent as well, like an 8, a 6, or a 4. And we see 8, 6, 4, cards that kind of wrap around and give you some sort of straights and 2 pairs is pretty good. Also, the 7 and the 5 are pretty good. 3 is actually pretty good too. I would not have predicted the 3 would be this good. And as you see, the high cards are just very, very bad, right? Which makes sense. Undergun +1 against big blind. They're going to have a lot of big cards when they bet, and just in their range in general, we have a lot of the low cards in our range when we check call. Okay? Now, take a second and ask yourself, which cards are we going to be leading on and how frequently? So remember, the 8, 6, and 4 are going to give you more equity than the 7 or 5, but the 7 or 5 is usually going to give you the nut advantage when you get it. Right? So in this scenario, I'll show you what we should be doing. Turns out 7 and 5, you're going to be leading decently often. The 8, 6, and 4, you're leading some, but not quite as frequently. And this is a spot where when the 8 comes, a lot of people just check every time, and it's probably not giving up too much in that scenario to check every time, but I definitely do recommend developing some sort of a leading strategy in this spot. Notice on all the other cards, you're checking the vast majority of the time. Like you see the 4, you in theory could lead 15% of the time or so, 17% of the time, something like that. I just wouldn't lead. If the turn is a 5, I would definitely be leading with a lot of my 5s and then a lot of my just like really, really trashy hands, like whatever backdoor draws I opted to check call the flop bet with. Something like that, I think, and that's going to put your opponent in a pretty bad spot. On a 7, I would be leading very, very frequently, kind of like on the Jack 6-2 board when the turn's a 6. So let's take a look at the 6 in this scenario, what the solver opts to do, because you're going to tell it's going to be very, very mixed what it does in this scenario. On the turn 6, let's just go through and take a look at what it's betting. All of these cards in the middle are going to be pretty strong. So like 9-8's the nuts. 9-7 is opting to lead a decent amount of the time. 9-7 is random middle pair with a gut shot. Okay. 9-6 is leading a lot. Random middle pair with a gut shot. 9-5 is bottom pair with a gut shot. Leads that a lot. 8-6 is open-ended straight draw and pair. Leads that a lot. 7s is a set. 7-6 is 2 pair. 6-5 is 2 pair. 6-4 middle pair and a gut shot. 5-4 bottom pair and a gut shot. All these are leading some portion of the time, right? So let's notice also 5-3, 6-3, 7-3. Really, like all of these hands that have any sort of equity are opting to lead on this turn. Also leading some top pairs, as you see. Not all of them, but some. Interesting, the weaker ones down here are leading. Wouldn't have really predicted that. And then just like a smattering of bluffs. And this is why it's kind of hard to develop an implementable strategy around these scenarios where you're leading some, but still just a relatively small portion of the time. But in this scenario, if you wanted to essentially take all of your like middle type hands that have pair plus gut shot, pair plus open-ended, and some nut hands and bet them, I think that's probably just okay. I don't really see a problem with that. It is going to make your checking range a little bit weak. I mean, take a look at this though. What does the solver do to make sure that its checking range is not very, very weak? Well, notice it's actually checking all of these middle cards half the time too. So maybe if you wanted to like lead with the nuts and with the bad pair plus gut shots, like 7-3 and 5-3 and 6-3, maybe that's the play. That way you're kind of polarized when you're leading, where you have effectively nut hands like strong 2 pairs and better and like weak pairs with gut shots. That could be a very viable strategy to develop. And then checking with the like 8-7s and the 9-7 type hands that have a little bit more equity. I think that could be reasonable. Notice solver really doesn't lead with the good kings all that often, which makes sense because that definitely helps protect the checking range. So I think that's probably what you should do in this scenario, and if you do that, you're going to be pretty tough to play against. That said, I do want to show you that like you shouldn't be leading all that often, but there really are a few common spots where you should be leading. Usually that's when the middle card pairs or the bottom card pairs, assuming you have a lot of the bottom card in your range, which sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. And also when you get 4 cards to a low straight, this is a scenario we're not going to go through, but essentially you need to be leading a ton whenever the 4 or the 6 comes on an 8-7-5 board, or 9, because you have a lot of the straights and your opponents don't. That's going to be a scenario where you get to bet again, or where you get to lead very, very frequently. So keep these spots in mind and actively look for them, and doing so will go a long way to increase your equity on the turn.